was born in a place called Goforth, Texas in 1930, the beginning of the Depression. I started in Buda Elementary. That was in the Buda School District. And started in September 1930, Bob and I started in the first grade in Buda Elementary School. Went all the way through school there together. And then I went into the military for a while, and I went back to university down here, which was Southwest Texas at that time. Jean and I married in 1952, and we moved to Kyle in 1954. In fact, Bob and I bought the Kyle News in 1953, and that's how I originally got connected with Kyle. And in 54, I started coaching and teaching in Kyle, and sold the paper to Bob, and got out of the paper business, and coached for several years, and 6 years, and then in 1960, I became the superintendent of schools in Kyle. And in 67, we consolidated Kyle, Buda, and Wimberley to form the Hayes CISD. And I became superintendent until I retired in 1984.
I was born April the 5th, 1930, in an Austin hospital, but my parents lived on the Coyote Ranch in west of Buda, which was about a mile west of where Dahlstrom Middle School is. And my family had come to the Buda area actually one branch of them had come there during Mexico, had bought land there during when it was still part of Mexico, so it'd been there a long time. Just never got enough money to move any further away, I suppose. And so my family's been in the Mountain City area in particular for a long, long time. Grew up in Buda, started the first grade. Some skinny little kid. I was skinny, and there was a skinny little kid I lived in Old Buda, which not many people did, and met Mo in the first grade, and he didn't tell you, he won I think the county championship for storytelling then, and he does still a pretty good job now. We went to high school together, graduated in the top 20 in the class, all of us, and went briefly to Southwest Texas at that time, State Teachers College, and into the Army. Came out, and we had this little business venture together, several ventures together, the Korean War. And then he decided to take a better outlook on life and became a coach and school teacher, and I went on to various businesses, some successful, some highly unsuccessful, and ended back in Kyle and have owned the newspaper off and on for much of the last 55 years.
Okay.
You go ahead.
Well, it was an interesting time. We started school in 1936 in the heart of the Depression. Schools were so much different then. And as we were talking before this meeting, I think basically we got a good education. Even though it was a small rural school district, Bob Barton became a state representative. I became a superintendent. A lot of those kids were college graduates. And it was a different world, a different era. We graduated, we went through high school in World War II, where the only way we could go to football games, people have a hard time believing this, we were on the Buda Bulldog football team. And we went in a cattle trailer, and the superintendent had a car, and he pulled the cattle trailer. And Bob and I were scrubs, we rode in the cattle trailer. And all the good players got to ride in the car. that is absolutely a true story. And but we graduated from Buda in 1947.
So we, in the last year of our classes, thought we actually decided to again play basketball, even though we were the only school in the district that didn't have a gymnasium. So they built an outdoor court, and the bad thing was that's the way it rained this year. It rained that spring and winter of 47, so we took it on ourselves, and we got off the school bus riding the first bus. There were two buses, and I guess we were from Goforth, the poor part of the district, so we were the first bus. We had to be on the first bus. We'd go out there in the mornings and drain the football field, the basketball field, so that we could practice later that day if it didn't rain anymore. Well, they didn't tell us that the war was just over, and the discipline was pretty slack. And I think the superintendent that year had resigned because of a nervous breakdown or something. And so the school board had hired, unbeknownst to us, a new man just back from the wars that wasn't too worried about disfavor among students. And so we had been skipping the school assembly to work on the basketball court. And we skipped it for his first day on the job. He calls us into the office and tells us to take a week's vacation from coming to class. My father was no longer a teacher, but I knew my mother was, I think, substitute teaching, and so there wasn't any way for me to deny the fact that I'd been expelled. Mo, on the other hand, parents weren't, they lived out about 6 miles, so he would get up every morning during his expulsion and ride the school bus to town and hang out down on the loafers bench with all the old men. And my father was a pretty good disciplinarian, and he is a pretty good psychologist. Our bitter enemy was Kyle. I lived at Old Goforth by then. The Kyle school went right by, school bus went right by our road down in front of our house. And he told me if I ever got in that kind of serious trouble again, said, you see that Kyle school bus, you'll be riding it and you'll be going to school in Kyle. He scared the hell out of me. I walked the straight and narrow for at least the rest of that year.
Let me expand on that a little bit. I never told my mother and dad. Now, discipline, this is kind of you taught school for many years. Discipline's changed a lot in school. I knew if I went home, now that, you think about what he's talking about. We were working on school grounds and expelled for a week. I was afraid to tell them. I knew not to tell them that because I knew whose side of that issue they were going to take. I knew, I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Years later, Betty, when I was in the military, I got courage enough to tell them I'd been expelled from school. You see, it's an interesting story. I've told that on discipline because I knew that I wasn't where I was supposed to be. And you didn't go home and tell mom and dad how you'd been mistreated at school in those days. It was a different world. The Korean War started. And I remember it was in June of 1950. And I didn't know what it was all about, but we were in the reserves together. We had a reserve unit in San Marcos. And they began to tell us that reserve unit was probably going to be recalled active duty because they were recalling reserve units to active duty. And so Bob got the bright idea that we ought to just volunteer to go back in. Well, we volunteered, and he and I and one or two more, and the rest of them stayed home. Never left Kyle and Buda. We went overseas. It's a miracle that we didn't get shot. We were fortunate enough to go to Germany. And I learned years later the reason we went to Germany, I was in a National Guard unit assigned to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and they didn't put them into combat. So Bob could have gotten me knocked off right then. And so we were both journalism majors. We were both majoring in journalism in Southwest Texas. And Bob got the bright idea, or somebody told him the Kyle News was for sale. And so we came to over here and investigated, and it was on Main Street up here in an old shack. It was just an old gasoline engine fired press, and we decided we'd buy it. The old man wanted $2,500 for it. Man, it was just horrible. We didn't have $2,500, so we go to the bank, which was right across the street where his office is over there. And that banking was different in those days. He wasn't interested in making loans. He looked at us, and he wouldn't no more loan us $2,500. So the local businessmen, Charles Young and maybe Cecil Bells,
His brother-in-law was.
they signed our note, and we bought the Kyle News. And that's really our beginning in Kyle. That's how we came to Kyle. And Bob married a Kyle girl. And then Jean and I later came, and I sold the Kyle News when I went into school minutes to Bob Barton. I sold him my interest in it for a box of cigars. And I never did get the cigars for about 30, 40 years, but I thought I made a good deal. I went into the school business. He stayed in it.
Yeah.
He's made a fortune in it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Sounded like a good idea to me, the benefit of one course that we were probably experienced journalists. And it did happen through, I don't think, we got even with the banker. The first issue we put out, his son got married, and the same time a man that later, Hispanic, Mexican-American man was getting married here. At that time there was considerable discrimination. We decided we evened the score to there. We put his the Hispanics wedding announcement and story on the front page, and buried the bankers back in the back. So that was gave us some satisfaction. Probably didn't help our business relationship with the bank any. But I'm not very smart, but I'm stubborn. So I kept it a few years and sold it. Did marry a Kyle girl, and acquired lots of friends here. And through the years, have bought and sold it 3 or 4 times, but have ended back up with it late in life, and at a time where we considered it. We were Buda boys. One interesting story is that one of the Kyle descendants, Mary Hartson Kyle, who was made the front of Life magazine in the 40s because she was the mayor of an all-women city council during the early part of the World War II. She was a very old lady, and she probably for health reasons took a dab of wine every day, and she also lived down past 2 doors through 2 streets down from the newspaper. The first day we hit town, we'd been labeled the 2 Buda boys that bought the Kyle newspaper. She came in and shook her finger at us and said, "If you Buda boys try to move this paper to this town, I'll bring down havoc on you all." And we didn't have enough money, or our Buda certainly was smaller than Kyle. We knew enough about economics that we had a better shot, if any.
I want to say something about that paper. When we bought it, he put out the paper on Thursday, and neither one of us knew anything. And Jean did half the work in the thing, and we'd spend all Thursday night trying to get the paper out. All night long. And then I had 8 o'clock classes, so many times Jean and I went home. She'd go to work, and I'd go to school. And but Betty had that was so antiquated that I don't know whether you've ever seen that. Every line of type was set by hand. There wasn't didn't have a line of type. And if you want to spell "the," you got a T and an H and an E, and everything. Can you imagine how long that took? And there was an old man that had been doing that for years, and he could do that. I wouldn't have had a clue. It's almost like typing. You had to pick him out. He was pretty fast with it. He died the first week. Second week we was there, and we were just hopeless. And we went down and made a deal with the San Marcos Record, and they had a line of type, and we'd take our copy down and they'd print it. And with that thing, you could hear it all over town. That old engine was like an old tractor. Chunk, chunk, chunk. It quit about half the time in the middle of the night. It was an experience I'll never forget.
Mr. Harwell was a good Methodist man, an old bachelor here, called him Red. And, he was quite a ladies. He was a single man, and he was quite a ladies' man. Not much of a talker. Well, he had already sold that paper to the San Marcos Record, and when he found out he had a couple of mullets on the hook, by that time he was so poor that his car didn't have gasoline, so we carried him, or at least I did. I think we both did, down to the San Marcos Record, and we stayed in the car, and he went in there and talked him out of the deal. In later life, for the next 20 years, he worked for me on and on if I had any money, and he told me when he was about 70 years old, not regretfully and pretty honestly, that he'd sold it to Mr. Buckner for $50, and he had to give Mr. Buckner the $50 to get our $2,500. So we had really made a good business deal.
And the way I became superintendent, Betty, kind of answered. I was coaching. You read, we had a great basketball teams, and we've been to state meet 5 years in a row. And I remember Red Seaman, who still lives here, was president of the school board when we consolidated the school district. He came to me and he said, "Mo, I'd gotten my master's degree, and I had my certification to be a superintendent." And he said, "Would you consider being superintendent?" I said, "No, Red, I like to coach." I said, "I enjoy what I'm doing." He said, "Well, just think about it." And I said, "Well, what does it pay?" Well, we're talking about 1960. And I think I was making probably $3,500 coaching and teaching, and it paid about $7,000. And I said, "I believe I can handle that." And that's a true story. I became superintendent I was elected in 1960. And one of the first things I noticed that Kyle did not have a lot of black students. But what they had about 25, and they had been a black school there for years. And they'd closed it, and they were sending them to San Marcos, to Dunbar. And we were paying them tuition to take those students. We were having to transport them down there, and this is not right. We don't have money. It's not right. It's not the right thing to do. It's not right for the kids. It's costing us money. So I talked to the board about it, and they agreed with me. Bob and a lot of the townspeople, the only way at that time, Betty, in 1960, legally, the law was that you had a dual school system. It means black and white schools were separate. And you cannot, now, Buda took theirs in, but they didn't vote like we
Right.
did. They did not have an election. And we had to have a vote to do that. We had to have an election to dissolve what they call the dual school system and integrate those schools. And I've always been real proud of Kyle. I've been proud of that because that election passed about 5-1. There was no opposition, no organized opposition against it. And in May of 1961, 61 is when it was, because it was the end of my first year. We brought those in. It was never a problem. And I think Buda and Kyle communities both are to be admired over the years for how they approached that, because in that period of time, it was really a hot issue. Most places, in Little Rock, Arkansas, and every place else in Georgia. But they did it here, and they did it the right way. And in neither place that I know of was it ever really a real difficult problem. And that's a tribute to the people of Buda and Kyle. And that's how it came about. And we integrated them. They started immediately playing on our athletic teams. And it was just a very smooth operation.
And then, of course, we got lucky. One of the first, when they first integrated, one of the first persons that was integrated was a guy named Poochie Green. He was from an old Kyle African American family who was could run with like lightning, and was on. I guess you were not coaching, but Kimbrough was coaching. Well, here some of the people, there were some people that weren't too keen to the idea, but it sure did make it easier to be forward when he ran for several touchdowns. And I went up to Blanco to a football game. I've told it, or Johnson City, told this story lots of times. And Poochie ran for 2 or 3 touchdowns, and at the half I was up getting some popcorn. There was an old mountaineer came up there white. They had a black colony there that was later became many famous football players, but they were not integrated. And this old man, I heard him tell the guy, says, "We got to get us one of those." And they did integrate shortly after, and went on to, a couple of them went and played pro football, right?
Yes. At the beginning of World War II, I believe there were 32 school districts in Hayes, different school districts in Hayes County. Now there's Wormley and Dripping Springs, St. Marks and Hayes. There's 4. So you can see that the consolidation of schools has been going on for a long time. Jean has got some interesting records she was talking about that Bob found in the basement of the old courthouse down here, the county school superintendents when they had him. And it's the history of all these schools. And it's amazing. A lot of them came to Kyle, a lot came to Buda. Over the years, Gulfport, Johnson School, Science Hall came here, Hemp Hill, all these. And when I became superintendent in Kyle in 1960, there was a guy named Preston Conley. He was a real interesting guy.